No parent should ever have to choose between their child and survival. Clara Hensley faced that terrible choice when her husband died, leaving her with nothing but debts and a 14-year-old daughter to protect. In the harsh winter of 1875, Clara made a deal with Caleb Stroud, the feared mountain man everyone whispered about. She handed over her daughter Mary to settle her debts. The whole town expected the worst from a man they barely knew and completely feared. But Caleb had a secret that would shock everyone in Copper Ridge. When he returned alone days later, he placed gold coins on Clara's table and spoke words that changed everything. What was Caleb really planning when he took Mary into the mountains? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind cut through Copper Ridge like a blade that winter of 1875, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of harder days ahead. Snow had been falling for 3 weeks straight, blanketing the small frontier town in a silence so complete that even the church bells seemed muffled when they rang each Sunday morning. Clara Hensley stood at her kitchen window, watching the white expanse where her husband Thomas used to chop wood. The axe still leaned against the old oak tree, its handle dark with age and weather, waiting for hands that would never hold it again. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, her breath fogging the pain as she tried to remember the sound of his laughter echoing across their small yard. 3 months had passed since they buried Thomas in the hillside cemetery overlooking the valley. 3 months since Clara's world had shifted on its axis, leaving her grasping for stability in a life that suddenly felt foreign. The consumption had taken him quickly, too quickly for proper goodbyes or final words of wisdom. One day he was splitting logs for the winter ahead, and within a week his chest was rattling with each labored breath, until finally, mercifully, it stopped altogether. "Mama, the fire's getting low again." Clara turned from the window to see her daughter Mary seated at their worn wooden table, her blonde hair catching the firelight as she bent over her schoolwork. At 14, Mary possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that reminded Clara so much of Thomas, it sometimes took her breath away. The girl had her father's thoughtful green eyes and his way of considering every word before speaking, as if she understood that words once spoken could never be taken back. "I'll tend to it in a moment, sweetheart," Clara replied, though they both knew their woodpile was running dangerously low. Each log now had to be carefully rationed, burned only when absolutely necessary. The cold was becoming more than an inconvenience, it was becoming an enemy. Clara moved away from the window and picked up the leather-bound ledger book that had become her constant companion these past weeks. Thomas Hensley's careful handwriting filled page after page with numbers that told the story of their modest life. Together. Grocery bills, feed for their small livestock, payments to the bank for their land, all meticulously recorded in his precise script. But scattered throughout the pages were other entries, ones Clara hadn't known about until after his death. Doctor visits he'd paid for quietly when old Mrs. Peterson couldn't afford her medicine. A loan to help the Millers rebuild their barn after the storm. Small kindnesses that spoke to Thomas's generous heart but had slowly drained their savings. The final pages of the ledger told a different story entirely. As Thomas's illness progressed and he could no longer work his trade as the town's blacksmith, the entries became fewer and the debts began to mount. Doctor bills, medicine costs, and finally the loan from Morrison's general store that had kept food on their table during Thomas's final weeks. The numbers seemed to dance mockingly on the page. $237, a sum that might as well have been $1,000 for all Clara's ability to pay it. "Mary, come help me with this arithmetic," Clara said, settling beside her daughter at the table. It was a game they played now, asking Mary to check figures that Clara had already calculated a dozen times, hoping somehow the numbers would change if someone else looked at them. Mary set down her pencil and leaned over the ledger, her young face serious as she ran her finger down the columns. "Mama, this doesn't add up right. We owe Mr. Morrison more money than Papa made in half a year." Clara's heart squeezed at the matter-of-fact way Mary stated their impossible situation. Her daughter understood poverty in the way that frontier children often did, not as a temporary setback, but as a condition that could swallow families whole if they weren't careful. "I know, sweet girl, but we'll find a way. We always do." The lie tasted bitter on Clara's tongue. There was no way, and they both knew it. Clara had already sold everything of value they owned. Thomas's good tools had gone to pay for his medicine. Her mother's china had covered the doctor bills. Even her wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper, had been traded to the seamstress for winter coats. All that remained was Thomas's ledger book, a constant reminder of their desperate circumstances, and Clara's simple gold wedding band, the one thing she couldn't bring herself to part with. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and finding every crack in their small cabin's walls. The sound reminded Clara of the conversation she'd overheard at the general store earlier that week. Morrison had been talking to the banker about families who couldn't pay their debts, his voice carrying that particular tone men used when discussing business that affected other people's lives. "Some folks think they can just let bills pile up without consequence," Morrison had said, counting coins into his cash box. "But come spring, I'll be needing payment in full. Can't run a store on promises and good intentions." Clara had stood frozen behind the flour sacks, Mary's small hand in hers, listening to their fate being decided by men who had never missed a meal or wondered where their next dollar would come from. She'd wanted to speak up, to explain their situation, but pride had kept her silent. Thomas had always handled their finances, their dealings with other men. Without him, Clara felt like she was speaking a language she'd never fully learned. That night, as Mary slept peacefully in the small bed they now shared to conserve heat, Clara had sat up, calculating and recalculating their options. She could take in washing, but the other women in town were already doing that work. She might find employment at the boarding house, but that would mean leaving Mary alone for long hours in an increasingly cold cabin. Every path forward seemed blocked by the simple reality that a widow with a young daughter had few choices in a place like Copper Ridge. The sound of horses approaching broke Clara from her reverie. Through the window, she could see two figures on horseback, making their way down the narrow road that led to their cabin. Even from a distance, she recognized the broad shoulders and steady posture of Caleb Stroud, the mountain man who came to town perhaps once a month for supplies. Beside him rode Morrison, the storekeeper, his smaller frame hunched against the cold. "Mary, go to our room and work on your reading," Clara said quietly, though her daughter was already gathering her books. Mary had developed an instinct for when adult conversations were about to turn serious. Clara smoothed her hair and straightened her worn dress before opening the door. The two men dismounted, Morrison with the careful movements of someone unused to riding in harsh weather, Caleb with the fluid grace of a man who spent most of his life in the saddle. "Mrs. Hensley," Morrison said, touching the brim of his hat, "sorry to trouble you on such a cold day, but we need to have a word." Caleb said nothing, but his dark eyes took in the details of Clara's situation with what seemed like professional assessment. She'd seen him around town often enough to know his reputation, a solitary man who trapped in the high country, trading furs and keeping largely to himself. Folks said he was dangerous, possibly an outlaw who'd fled civilization for the anonymity of the wilderness. Others whispered that he'd killed men, though no one could say for certain. What everyone agreed on was that Caleb Stroud was not a man to cross. "Please, come in out of the cold," Clara said, though her small cabin suddenly felt even more humble with these two very different men filling the doorway. Morrison entered first, removing his hat and gloves with the fussy precision of a merchant. Caleb followed, and Clara was struck by how his presence seemed to change the very air in the room. He was taller than she'd realized, with shoulders that spoke of years spent swinging axes and hauling traps. His hair was longer than most men wore it in town, dark brown with threads of premature silver, and his face bore the weathered complexion of someone who spent his days under an open sky. But it was his eyes that gave Clara pause, not the cold, calculating stare she'd expected, but something deeper, more thoughtful. The eyes of a man who had seen much and judged little. "Mrs. Hensley," Morrison began, settling into the chair Clara offered. "I've come about the matter of your husband's debt to my store. I'm afraid the time for payment has come." Clara's mouth went dry. "I understand, Mr. Morrison. If you could give me just a few more weeks." "I'm afraid that's not possible." Morrison's voice carried the finality of a man used to making difficult decisions. "I've been patient, given your circumstances, but I have my own obligations to meet. The debt stands at $237, and I'll need payment by week's end, or I'll have to take possession of this property to settle the account." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She glanced toward the room where Mary was reading, imagining having to tell her daughter they would be homeless, possibly separated if Clara couldn't find work and shelter for both of them. "I don't have that kind of money," Clara said quietly. "You know I don't." "I know," Morrison replied, not unkindly, "which is why I've brought Mr. Stroud along. He's made me an interesting proposition." Clara's eyes moved to Caleb, who had remained standing near the door, his hat in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was deeper than she'd expected, roughened by years of living outdoors, but not harsh. "Mrs. Hensley, I find myself in need of help with domestic work, cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. Your daughter is old enough to handle such responsibilities." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet as she understood what was being suggested. "You're saying you want to take Mary in exchange for paying our debt?" Clara's voice was barely a whisper. Caleb's expression remained neutral. "I'm offering employment for your daughter, good wages that would more than cover what you owe Morrison here, plus enough to see you through the winter." Clara's hands shook as she gripped the back of her chair. This was the moment she'd dreaded, the choice she'd hoped would never come. But looking at these two men, Morrison with his business ledger and Caleb with his enigmatic offer, she realized that fate had finally cornered her family. From the next room came the soft sound of Mary turning pages, the innocent rustle of a girl reading by firelight, unaware that her childhood was about to end. Clara closed her eyes and thought of Thomas, wondering what he would do, what he would want her to do. When she opened them again, Caleb was watching her with something that might have been sympathy. But sympathy wouldn't keep them warm or fed, and it wouldn't prevent them from being turned out into the winter snow. "What kind of work exactly?" Clara asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "Keeping house, preparing meals, general domestic duties," Caleb replied. "Nothing more, nothing less." Morrison cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hensley, I should mention that Mr. Stroud here has offered to pay the full amount immediately, in gold coin. Your debt would be settled, and you'd be free of financial obligation." Clara looked between the two men, trying to read the truth behind their carefully chosen words. Caleb's reputation preceded him, a man who lived alone in the mountains, who kept to himself and trusted no one. What would he want with a 14-year-old girl? The possibilities that came to mind made her stomach turn. But then she thought of Mary shivering in their cold bed, of the empty pantry and the dwindling woodpile. She thought of being turned out into the snow with nowhere to go and no way to provide for her daughter. Sometimes, she realized, there were no good choices, only the choice between different kinds of loss. "How long would this arrangement last?" Clara asked. "Through the winter," Caleb replied. "When spring comes, we can reassess the situation." Clara nodded slowly, though every instinct screamed against what she was considering. But instincts were luxuries she could no longer afford. "I'll need to discuss this with Mary," she said finally. "Of course," Morrison said, rising from his chair. "But I'll need an answer soon, Mrs. Hensley, very soon." After the men left, Clara sat alone in her kitchen, staring at Thomas's ledger book and trying to imagine explaining to her daughter that their world was about to change again. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault on their small cabin, as if nature itself was conspiring to force her hand. She thought about the gold wedding ring on her finger, the last tangible link to the life she'd built with Thomas. Soon, even that might not be enough to save them. Sometimes, Clara thought, surviving meant making choices that broke your heart, and sometimes broken hearts were all you had left to bargain with. 3 days passed before Morrison returned, this time alone, and carrying a folded piece of paper that crackled in the morning cold. Clara had spent those days in a fog of indecision, watching Mary go about her daily routine, feeding their remaining chickens, mending clothes by the fire, reading aloud from her schoolbooks, all while knowing that each moment might be among their last together. The debt notice Morrison handed her was official, stamped with the territorial seal and written in the formal language of legal proceedings. Clara's hands trembled as she read the words that would destroy what remained of her family's stability. Final notice of debt collection. Payment in full required within 24 hours or seizure of property will commence. "I'm sorry it's come to this, Mrs. Hensley," Morrison said, though his voice carried more irritation than sympathy. "But I've got my own creditors breathing down my neck. The bank won't extend my credit any further if I can't collect what's owed to me." Clara folded the notice carefully, as if handling it gently might somehow lessen its impact. "And Mr. Stroud's offer still stands?" "It does. He's waiting at the general store now, as a matter of fact. Came down from the mountains this morning with a pouch full of gold coins. Real gold, Mrs. Hensley, not promises or promissory notes." The weight of Morrison's words settled over Clara like a burial shroud. Real gold meant real salvation or real damnation, depending on what Caleb Stroud truly intended for her daughter. "I'll need to speak with him directly," Clara said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Morrison nodded. "I'll tell him to expect you within the hour." After he left, Clara found Mary in their shared bedroom, carefully mending a tear in her winter dress. The girl's nimble fingers worked the needle, with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned early that everything must be preserved, nothing wasted. "Mary, we need to talk." Her daughter looked up, and Clara saw her own fear reflected in those green eyes. Mary had always been perceptive, old enough to understand that serious conversations between adults usually meant bad news for children. "It's about Mr. Morrison's visit, isn't it?" Mary asked, setting down her sewing. Clara sat on the edge of their bed, choosing her words carefully. "We're going to lose the house, sweetheart. I don't have the money to pay what we owe." Mary nodded, as if she'd been expecting this news. "Where will we go? That's what I need to discuss with you. There's a man, Mr. Stroud, you've probably seen him around town. He's offered to help us, but it would mean you going to work for him for a while." "What kind of work?" Mary's voice was small but steady. "Housekeeping, cooking. He lives up in the mountains, away from town." Clara couldn't bring herself to voice her deeper fears about what a solitary man might want with a young girl. Mary was quiet for a long moment, her young face serious as she considered their situation. When she spoke again, her words carried a maturity that broke Clara's heart. "If I don't go, we'll both be on the street, won't we?" Clara's throat tightened. "I'll find another way, Mary. I won't let anything happen to you. But there isn't another way, is there?" Mary's question was gentle but direct. "Not really." Clara pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair, trying to memorize the feeling of Mary safe in her arms. "I'm going to talk to Mr. Stroud first. I need to understand exactly what he's proposing." An hour later, Clara made her way through the snow-covered streets of Copper Ridge, past the familiar storefronts and houses that had comprised her entire world for the past 8 years. The town seemed different now, viewed through the lens of desperation, smaller, more insular, offering fewer possibilities than she'd ever realized. Morrison's General Store occupied the central corner of Main Street, its false front painted green and gold to suggest prosperity. Clara had shopped here countless times, bringing Mary to pick out penny candy on special occasions, trading Thomas's blacksmith work for household goods. Now she was here to negotiate her daughter's future with a man most of the town feared. The bell above the door chimed as Clara entered, and she was immediately aware of the conversations that stopped, the curious glances from other customers. Word traveled fast in a small town, and by now, everyone knew about the Hensley family's troubles. Caleb Stroud stood near the back of the store, examining a display of hunting knives with the careful attention of someone who understood the value of quality tools. In the better light of the store, Clara could see him more clearly than she had during his visit to her cabin. His clothes were well-made but practical wool shirt, leather vest, denim trousers that showed wear but not poverty. His boots were expensive, crafted for hard use in rough country. Whatever else he was, Caleb Stroud was not a poor man. "Mr. Stroud," Clara said, approaching with what she hoped looked like confidence. He turned, and again she was struck by his eyes, dark brown, almost black, but lacking the hardness she'd expected. "Mrs. Hensley," Morrison said, "you'd be coming by." "I'd like to discuss your proposal more specifically," Clara said, acutely aware that their conversation was being overheard by half the town. Caleb glanced around the store, noting the same audience Clara had observed. "Perhaps we could speak outside." They stepped onto the wooden sidewalk that ran in front of the store, where the cold air carried the sounds of normal town life, children playing in the snow, the ring of hammer on anvil from the new blacksmith, the distant lowing of cattle. It was the soundtrack of a world that would continue unchanged, whether Clara made this deal or not. "I need to know exactly what you expect from Mary," Clara said without preamble. Caleb was quiet for a moment, studying her face as if trying to gauge her sincerity. "I expect her to keep my cabin clean, prepare basic meals, perhaps do some mending. Nothing more complicated than what she'd do in her own home. Din mine." "And nothing else?" Clara pressed, holding his gaze. "Nothing else." His answer was firm, without hesitation or the uncomfortable shifting that might suggest deception. "Where exactly is your cabin?" "About 15 miles northeast of here, up in the pine country. It's isolated but comfortable. She'd have her own room, proper food, warm clothes." Clara found herself studying this enigmatic man, trying to reconcile his fearsome reputation with the straightforward way he answered her questions. "The people in town say things about you, that you're dangerous." Caleb's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "People say a lot of things about men who choose to live alone. Most of it's nonsense. But some of it isn't. I've had to defend myself on occasion. The mountains can be a hard place, and not everyone who ventures up there has honest intentions." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "But I've never harmed anyone who didn't mean harm to me first." It wasn't quite the reassurance Clara had hoped for, but it was more honest than empty promises would have been. She appreciated that he didn't try to paint himself as something he wasn't. "Why are you doing this?" Clara asked. "You don't know us. You could hire help from any number of families in town." Caleb was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight of old pain. "I had a sister once, younger than your Mary. When our parents died, there was no one to help, no one to offer work or a way forward." He stared out at the snow-covered mountains visible beyond the town's edge. "She didn't survive that winter." The simple statement hit Clara like a physical blow. In those few words, she heard echoes of her own current situation, the terrible vulnerability of families without resources or options. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "It was a long time ago." Caleb turned back to her, and his expression had returned to its carefully neutral mask. "But it taught me something about what happens when children are left without protection or opportunity." Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the fear that had gripped her since Morrison first mentioned Caleb's proposal. This wasn't a predator seeking to exploit their desperation. This was a man trying to prevent another family from experiencing the loss that had shaped his own life. "If I agree to this, when would you want Mary to come with you?" "As soon as possible. The weather's been holding, but there's more snow coming. Better to make the journey before the passes become impassable." Clara nodded, though the practical reality of sending her daughter away was almost overwhelming. "I'll need to explain everything to her, help her pack her things." "Of course." And Mrs. Hensley, Caleb reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of metal coins. "I'll pay Morrison your debt in full before we leave town. You'll have a clear title to your property and enough extra to see you through the winter." The pouch was heavier than Clara had expected when he placed it in her hands. She could feel the weight of real gold through the leather, more money than she'd seen since Thomas died. "This is too much," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's what the arrangement is worth to me," Caleb replied simply. They stood in silence for a moment, two people bound together by necessity and circumstance, while around them the normal life of Copper Ridge continued. Clara could feel the weight of watching eyes, the whispered conversations that would follow both her and Mary for weeks to come. "I'll have her ready by tomorrow morning," Clara said finally. Caleb nodded. "I'll come for her at first light." As Clara walked home through the snow, the leather pouch heavy in her coat pocket, she felt as though she were moving through a dream. In less than 24 hours, her world had been reduced to this single terrible choice. Tomorrow morning, she would hand her daughter over to a virtual stranger and trust that his intentions were as honorable as his words suggested. That evening, as she helped Mary pack her few belongings into Thomas's old traveling bag, Clara tried to memorize every detail of her daughter's face, every gesture and expression. Mary moved through the preparations with the same quiet competence she brought to all her tasks, but Clara could see the fear beneath her composed exterior. "I'll write to you," Mary said as she folded her spare dress into the bag. "Mr. Stroud said there's a mail route that passes near his place once a month." "I'll write back," Clara promised, "every day, whether the mail runs or not." As they worked together in the lamplight, both mother and daughter carefully avoided speaking about the darker possibilities that lay ahead. Instead, they focused on practical matters, which books Mary should take, whether she needed her heavier winter coat, how long the arrangement might last. But beneath their careful normalcy lay the unspoken fear that this might be the last night they would spend together as a family. Clara held that fear close, using it to memorize every moment, every word, every shared glance that might have to sustain her through the lonely months ahead. Outside, the wind continued its restless song through the pine trees, carrying with it the promise of change that could not be avoided or undone. Dawn came too soon, and not soon enough. Clara had barely slept, spending the dark hours listening to Mary's quiet breathing and watching the shadows move across their small room. When the first pale light began to filter through their frost-covered window, both mother and daughter were already awake, lying still in their shared bed, as if movement might somehow accelerate the inevitable. "Mama," Mary whispered, her voice small in the pre-dawn quiet. "Yes, sweetheart? Are you going to be all right here by yourself?" Clara's heart clenched at the question. Even facing her own uncertain future, Mary was worried about her mother's welfare. It was so typical of her thoughtful daughter, always considering others before herself. "I'll be fine," Clara said, though the words felt hollow. "Mr. Stroud paid our debt and gave us extra money. I won't have to worry about losing the house, and I can take my time finding work." Mary nodded against her pillow, accepting her mother's reassurance with the trust that only children could offer. Clara pulled her daughter closer, inhaling the familiar scent of her hair, trying to imprint the moment in her memory. When they finally rose and began their morning routine, everything felt surreal and too ordinary at the same time. Clara made breakfast from their meager supplies while Mary finished packing her belongings. The traveling bag sat by the door like an accusation, stuffed with everything Mary owned in the world. 2 dresses, her winter coat, a handful of books, and the small rag doll she'd treasured since childhood. The doll had been a gift from Thomas on Mary's 7th birthday, carefully crafted by hand with button eyes and yarn hair. Clara had suggested leaving it behind, thinking Mary might want to appear more grown-up to her new employer, but her daughter had insisted on bringing it. "It was Papa's last present to me," Mary had said simply, tucking the doll into the bag with gentle care. "I can't leave her." Now, as Clara watched Mary eat her breakfast with mechanical precision, she was glad her daughter had kept this small piece of comfort. Whatever lay ahead in Caleb Stroud's mountain cabin, Mary would have something familiar to hold onto in the dark moments. The sound of hoofbeats on the frozen ground announced Caleb's arrival, just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains. Clara opened the door to find him sitting astride a large bay horse, with a smaller chestnut mare on a lead rope beside him. Both animals were well fed and carefully tended, their coats thick with winter hair and their tack in excellent repair. "Good morning, Mrs. Hensley," Caleb said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice carried easily in the cold air, deeper and more reassuring than Clara remembered. "Mr. Stroud." Clara stepped aside to let him enter, noting how he removed his hat and wiped his boots before crossing the threshold. Whatever his reputation, he had been raised with proper manners. Mary stood near the fireplace, her traveling bag at her feet and her winter coat buttoned up to her chin. She looked impossibly young and vulnerable, but her spine was straight and her chin raised with determined courage. "Miss Mary," Caleb said, his voice gentling as he addressed her directly. "Are you ready for our journey?" "Yes, sir," Mary replied, though Clara could hear the tremor beneath her steady words. Caleb seemed to notice it too, because he knelt down to Mary's eye level, his large frame folding with surprising grace. "I know this is frightening," he said quietly. "Leaving your mother, going to a strange place with someone you don't know, but I give you my word that you'll be safe with me." Mary studied his face with the serious attention she brought to all important matters. "Mama says you lost your sister when you were young." Clara tensed, worried that such a direct question might offend him, but Caleb didn't seem disturbed by Mary's forthright manner. "I did," he said simply. "She was about your age when she died. I've regretted ever since that I wasn't able to help her." "Is that why you're helping us?" "Partly," Caleb admitted, "but also because you and your mother deserve better than what this town has offered you." Mary seemed satisfied with his answer. She picked up her bag and moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back to Clara. For a moment, her composed facade cracked, revealing the frightened child beneath. "Mama," she whispered, and then she was in Clara's arms, clinging with desperate intensity. Clara held her daughter tightly, breathing in her scent one last time, memorizing the feel of Mary's small body against her own. "Be good," she whispered. "Be careful. Remember that I love you more than anything in this world." "I love you too, Mama." They held each other until Caleb cleared his throat gently, reminding them that the weather wouldn't wait for their goodbyes to be finished. "The mare is gentle," Caleb said as he helped Mary mount the chestnut horse. "Her name is Daisy, and she knows the mountain trails better than most people. Just hold the reins lightly and let her follow my horse." Clara watched as he adjusted Mary's stirrups and checked that her bag was securely tied behind the saddle. His movements were efficient but careful, and she noticed how he spoke quietly to both horses, calming them with his presence. "Mrs. Hensley," Caleb said as he swung up onto his own mount, "I'll send word when we arrive safely at my cabin, and if you need anything at all, leave a message with Morrison. I check for mail and supplies monthly." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She stood in her doorway, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and watched as the two riders made their way down the path that led away from her home and toward the distant mountains. Mary turned back once, raising her hand in a small wave that broke Clara's heart completely. Then they were around the bend and gone, leaving only the sound of hoofbeats fading in the distance and the whisper of wind through the pine trees. The journey into the mountains took them along a trail that wound steadily upward, through stands of towering pines and across meadows white with unmarked snow. Mary had ridden before Thomas had taught her on their old plough horse, but never for such a distance or in such wild country. Caleb set an easy pace, allowing the horses to rest frequently and checking often to make sure Mary was managing the ride comfortably. He spoke little during their travel, but when he did, his words were thoughtful and reassuring. "Those tracks there belong to elk," he said, pointing to deep impressions in the snow beside the trail. "Whole herd passed through here yesterday, heading down to the valley for easier grazing." Mary studied the tracks with interest, trying to imagine the large animals that had made them. In town, the biggest wildlife she'd seen were the occasional deer that wandered through people's gardens, but these mountains clearly hosted creatures on a completely different scale. "Are there bears up here?" she asked, proud that her voice didn't shake with the question. "Some," Caleb admitted. "But they're sleeping now, won't wake up until spring. By then, you'll know the country well enough to avoid their territories." The casual assumption that she would still be here in spring made Mary's stomach flutter with uncertainty. She tried to imagine herself in this wild place for months, learning the habits of bears and elk, becoming someone who understood mountain trails and winter weather. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and colder, but Mary found herself warming to the stark beauty of the landscape. Snow-laden branches created natural arches over the trail, and the silence was so complete she could hear the whisper of snowflakes landing on her coat. "It's beautiful," she said, surprising herself with the admission. Caleb turned in his saddle to look back at her, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw him smile, a small, genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "It is," he agreed. "Harsh sometimes, but beautiful. Your mother won't have told you this, but beauty matters as much as bread when you're trying to make a life worth living." They stopped for lunch beside a frozen stream, where Caleb built a small fire and heated water for coffee. He shared his food with generosity that reminded Mary of her father's quiet kindness: thick slices of bread, dried meat that was better than anything she'd tasted in months, and sweet preserved fruit that made her eyes widen with pleasure. "Where did this come from?" she asked, savoring the taste of peaches that seemed impossible in this winter landscape. "I trade with folks down in Colorado," Caleb explained. "Furs for supplies, jerky for luxuries. Man can't live on game alone, no matter what some people think." As they ate, Mary found herself studying this man who had become responsible for her welfare. His hands were large and scarred from years of hard work, but they moved with surprising gentleness as he tended the fire and served their meal. His face showed the weathering of someone who spent his life outdoors, but his eyes held an intelligence that spoke of education and thoughtful consideration. "Mr. Stroud," Mary said carefully, "what will you want me to do at your cabin?" "Call me Caleb," he said. "And as for work, nothing you haven't done before. Cooking, cleaning, mending clothes. I'm not particular about fancy housekeeping, but I appreciate having meals prepared and a fire ready when I come in from checking my trap lines." Mary nodded, relieved that his expectations seemed reasonable. "How often do you check your traps?" "Every few days, depending on the weather. Sometimes I'm gone overnight if the route takes me to the far boundaries of my territory." He paused, studying her face. "You won't be afraid staying alone in the cabin?" The question was asked with genuine concern, not judgment, and Mary considered it seriously before answering. "I might be at first," she admitted, "but I'll learn." Caleb smiled at her honest response. "That's exactly the right answer. Fear's natural in a new place, but learning makes it manageable." They finished their meal in companionable silence, Mary warming her hands around her cup of coffee, while Caleb banked the fire and prepared for the next portion of their journey. Around them, the mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, beautiful and intimidating in their vast indifference to human concerns. When they finally reached Caleb's cabin in the late afternoon, Mary's first impression was one of pleasant surprise. She had expected something crude and primitive, but the structure before her was well built and welcoming, with smoke rising from a stone chimney and windows that gleamed with actual glass. "Home," Caleb said simply, dismounting and moving to help Mary down from her horse. As her feet touched the ground, Mary realized that this word home would have to mean something different now. This place, this man, this new life would have to become familiar in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But looking at the solid cabin with its promise of warmth and shelter, listening to Caleb speak gently to the horses as he led them toward a well-built stable, Mary felt the first small stirring of something that wasn't quite hope, but wasn't despair either. Perhaps, she thought, touching the outline of her doll through her bag, this wouldn't be the end of her story after all. The interior of Caleb's cabin revealed even more surprises than its well-maintained exterior had suggested. Mary stepped through the heavy wooden door into a space that was both rustic and refined, furnished with handcrafted pieces that spoke of skill and care. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth surrounded by comfortable chairs, upholstered in what appeared to be fine leather. Shelves lined another wall, filled with more books than Mary had seen outside of the town's small library. "This isn't what I expected," Mary said quietly, setting down her traveling bag and looking around with undisguised curiosity. Caleb hung his coat on a peg near the door and moved to stoke the fire, which had been banked but not extinguished during his absence. "What did you expect?" Mary considered the question honestly. "Something rougher, I suppose, more like what people in town said about mountain men and their ways." "People in town say a lot of things," Caleb replied, echoing his earlier conversation with her mother. "Most of them based on stories rather than experience." As warmth began to fill the cabin, Mary explored more carefully. The kitchen area was compact but well-equipped, with cast-iron pots hanging from hooks and shelves stocked with supplies. A wooden table dominated the center of the room, its surface worn smooth by years of use, but carefully maintained. Near the books, she noticed a leather-bound volume lying open, as if Caleb had been reading before leaving to collect her. "Poetry?" Mary asked, approaching the book with interest. Caleb glanced over from where he was adding wood to the fire. "Keats. I find his work particularly suited to mountain evenings." Mary stared at him in astonishment. The idea of this rugged mountain man reading poetry by firelight was so far from his reputation that she wondered if she was dreaming. "People in town think you're dangerous," she said before she could stop herself. "I can be when circumstances require it," Caleb said matter-of-factly. "But danger and education aren't mutually exclusive. Some of the most dangerous men I've known were also the most well-read." He stood and moved to a door at the back of the cabin, gesturing for Mary to follow. "This will be your room," he said, opening the door to reveal a small but comfortable space. A narrow bed was made up with clean quilts, and a small chest of drawers stood beneath a window that looked out toward the valley they had traveled through. On the bed lay a stack of what appeared to be new clothes. "I had Morrison order these when I made our arrangement with your mother," Caleb explained, noting Mary's surprised expression. "Mountain weather requires different clothing than what you're used to in town." Mary touched the topmost garment, a wool dress in deep blue, clearly made for warmth rather than fashion. Beneath it were undergarments, thick stockings, and what appeared to be trousers designed for a woman, something she had never owned before. "Trousers?" she asked, holding up the unusual garment. "For working around the cabin and stable," Caleb said. "Dresses are impractical for many of the tasks you'll need to do here. I hope that doesn't offend your sensibilities." Mary considered this. The idea of wearing men's clothing would have scandalized the ladies of Copper Ridge, but then again, she was no longer bound by their expectations. "I think it sounds practical," she said finally. Caleb nodded approvingly. "Practicality is highly valued in the mountains. Fashion is a luxury that can sometimes prove dangerous." As Mary unpacked her few belongings and arranged them in her new room, she found herself thinking about this unexpected side of her new situation. The man who had taken her from her mother was not the crude, threatening figure she had feared, but rather someone who read poetry and understood the value of proper clothing for mountain work. That evening, as Caleb prepared their dinner, Mary observed his movements with growing fascination. He cooked with the same careful attention he brought to everything else, seasoning their simple meal of venison and vegetables with herbs that filled the cabin with delicious aromas. When he set their plates on the wooden table, the food was better than anything she had eaten since her father's death. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Mary asked, savoring a bite of perfectly prepared meat. "Necessity, mostly," Caleb replied. "A man living alone either learns to cook well or spends his life eating poorly. I prefer the former." As they ate, Mary found the courage to ask more direct questions about her situation. "How long do you expect me to stay here?" Caleb considered the question while cutting his meat. "As long as it takes for your mother to establish herself securely, or until you decide you'd prefer to return to town, whichever comes first." The answer surprised Mary with its fairness. She had expected to be told she would remain until Caleb no longer needed her services, not that her own preferences would be considered. "What if I wanted to leave tomorrow?" she asked, testing the boundaries of his offer. "Then I would take you back to town tomorrow," Caleb said simply, "though I'd ask that you consider staying at least long enough to see if this arrangement might benefit you as well as your mother." After dinner, Caleb returned to his poetry while Mary explored the books on his shelves. She found works by authors she recognized and many she didn't, volumes of philosophy, natural history, and literature that spoke of a mind hungry for knowledge and ideas. On one shelf, she discovered a collection of books specifically about education and teaching methods. "Are you a teacher?" she asked, holding up one of the volumes. Caleb looked up from his book, and for a moment something complex passed across his features. "I was, once, before I came to the mountains." "What happened?" "War happened," he said quietly. "The kind of experiences that make a man question whether he's fit for civilized society." Mary sensed there was much more to this story, but something in Caleb's tone discouraged further questions. Instead, she selected a book of natural history and settled into one of the leather chairs by the fire. They read in comfortable silence for an hour, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional turning of pages. It was, Mary realized, the most peaceful evening she had experienced since her father's death. There was something deeply calming about this quiet routine, this assumption that reading and thinking were valuable ways to spend time. When Caleb finally closed his book and announced it was time to retire for the evening, Mary felt almost disappointed that the day was ending. "Mary," he said as she prepared to go to her room, "I want you to understand something important. You're not a servant here, despite what the arrangement with your mother might suggest. You're a young woman who deserves respect and consideration. If I ever say or do anything that makes you uncomfortable, I want you to tell me immediately." The seriousness of his tone and the sincerity in his eyes convinced Mary that he meant every word. "Thank you," she said quietly. "And if you ever feel afraid or uncertain about anything at all, don't hesitate to speak up. The mountains can be dangerous if you don't know their rules, but they can also be the safest place in the world if you do." That night, lying in her new bed beneath warm quilts, Mary listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain night. Wind sighed through the pines, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the haunting call of what might have been a wolf. Instead of frightening her, these wild sounds felt oddly comforting, as if the mountains themselves were singing her to sleep. She thought about her mother, alone in their cabin in Copper Ridge, and felt a pang of homesickness. But alongside that familiar ache was something new, a tentative sense of possibility that she hadn't felt in months. Here, in this unexpected place with this surprising man, perhaps there might be opportunities she had never imagined. Mary reached under her pillow and touched her doll, her last connection to the childhood that was rapidly receding behind her. But for the first time since her father's death, she didn't feel like she was losing everything. Instead, she felt like she might be discovering something entirely new. The next morning brought Mary's first real taste of mountain life. Caleb woke her before dawn, not harshly, but with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to early rising. "Time to learn about morning chores," he said, offering her a cup of coffee that was stronger and more bitter than anything she'd tasted before. Outside, the world was transformed by a light snowfall during the night. Everything gleamed white and silver in the pre-dawn light, and Mary's breath formed clouds in the crisp air. Caleb led her to the stable, where his horses nickered softly at their approach. "Animals first, always," he explained, as he showed her how to measure out feed and check their water. "They depend on us completely, so their needs take priority over our comfort." Mary listened carefully as he explained the daily routine, feeding and watering the horses, collecting eggs from the chickens he kept in a coop attached to the stable, checking the small root cellar where he stored vegetables and preserved foods. Each task was simple in itself, but together they formed a complex web of responsibilities that kept life functioning in this remote place. "The key to mountain living," Caleb said, as they returned to the cabin, with arms full of eggs and firewood, "is understanding that everything is connected. Neglect one small thing, and it can cascade into larger problems." As they prepared breakfast together, Mary found herself appreciating the rhythm of these morning tasks. There was something satisfying about starting the day with productive work, about knowing that every action served a clear purpose in maintaining their small world. "Caleb," she said as they sat down to eat, "yesterday you mentioned that you check trap lines. What exactly does that involve?" "I run a series of traps through the mountains, catching fur-bearing animals that I trade for supplies and income," he explained. "It requires traveling established routes every few days, checking each trap, resetting them as needed, and preparing any pelts for market." Mary nodded, trying to imagine this work. "And you said sometimes you're gone overnight?" "When the route takes me to the far boundaries of my territory, yes. It's about a day's ride to the farthest traps, so I usually stay at a small shelter I built up there and return the following evening." The idea of being alone in the cabin didn't frighten Mary as much as she had expected. After just one night in this place, she was beginning to feel its solid security, its sense of being a refuge from the world rather than a prison. "What would I do while you're gone?" she asked. "Maintain the cabin, tend the animals, keep the fires going," Caleb said. "The same things you'd do if I were here, just with more responsibility for making decisions on your own." Mary found herself looking forward to this test of independence, this chance to prove she could manage on her own in this challenging place. It was a far cry from the protected, limited life she had known in town, where young ladies were expected to defer to others and avoid taking risks. Here, in Caleb's mountain retreat, it seemed that she might have the chance to discover what she was truly capable of becoming. 2 weeks into Mary's stay at the mountain cabin, Caleb announced they would be taking a longer journey, not to check trap lines, but to visit his sister. The revelation that he had family nearby came as a complete surprise to Mary, who had imagined him as entirely solitary. "Elizabeth teaches at a small school about a day's ride from here," Caleb explained as they prepared for the trip. "She's been wanting to meet you ever since I wrote to tell her about our arrangement." Mary felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect of meeting someone new, especially someone whose opinion might matter to Caleb. "What kind of school?" "She runs a small academy for children whose families can afford a better education than what's available in the mining camps and frontier towns," Caleb said, checking the supplies they would need for the journey. "Elizabeth came west from Massachusetts after our parents died, determined to bring proper learning to places that needed it most." The journey to Elizabeth's school took them through some of the most beautiful country Mary had ever seen. They rode through valleys where deer grazed peacefully in snow-covered meadows, past frozen waterfalls that gleamed like crystal sculptures, and along ridges that offered views of mountain ranges stretching endlessly into the distance. "Your sister chose to come to this wilderness?" Mary asked, as they paused to rest the horses beside a particularly stunning vista. "Elizabeth has always been drawn to challenges," Caleb said with obvious fondness. "She could have stayed in Boston, married well, lived a comfortable life. Instead, she chose to bring education to children who might never have the chance otherwise." Mary found herself both curious and intimidated by this description. A woman educated enough to run a school, brave enough to choose frontier life over Eastern comfort, sounded formidable in ways Mary wasn't sure she could match. When they finally arrived at the school, Mary's first impression was of a place that managed to be both rustic and refined. The building itself was larger than she had expected, a two-story structure with real glass windows and a bell tower that spoke of serious educational purpose. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and she could hear the sound of children's voices reciting lessons. Elizabeth Stroud emerged from the school building as they dismounted, and Mary immediately understood why Caleb spoke of his sister with such respect. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a practical but elegant style and intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing. Her dress was simple but well made, and she moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Caleb," she said warmly, embracing her brother with obvious affection, "and this must be Mary." "Yes, ma'am," Mary replied, suddenly conscious of her mountain clothes and wind-blown hair. Elizabeth studied her with kind but penetrating eyes. "I've heard a great deal about you, my dear. Caleb tells me you're an excellent reader and quick to learn new tasks." Mary felt herself blushing at the unexpected praise. "I try to be useful, ma'am." "Please, call me Elizabeth. And usefulness is admirable, but I'm more interested in your curiosity. Caleb mentioned that you've been exploring his library." As Elizabeth led them into the school building, Mary was amazed by what she saw. The main room contained rows of desks occupied by children ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 16, all focused intently on their lessons. Maps covered the walls alongside charts showing mathematical formulas and anatomical drawings. At the front of the room stood a large slate board covered with Latin conjugations. "How many students do you have?" Mary asked, impressed by the scope of the operation. 23 at present," Elizabeth replied. "Children from mining families, ranchers, even a few whose parents sent them here from as far away as Denver. Their families recognize that education is the key to opportunities their children might not otherwise have." Mary watched the students working some bent-over arithmetic problems, others reading from leather-bound texts. A few engaged in what appeared to be a scientific experiment involving glass beakers and careful measurements. The level of learning taking place here was far beyond anything offered in Copper Ridge's simple schoolhouse. "It's wonderful," Mary said quietly, and meant it. Elizabeth smiled at her response. "Would you like to observe some classes while you're here? I think you might find our approach interesting." Over the next several hours, Mary sat in on lessons that opened her mind to possibilities she had never imagined. Elizabeth taught with a combination of rigor and encouragement that made even difficult subjects seem approachable. She demanded excellence from her students, but provided the support necessary for them to achieve it. During a break between classes, Elizabeth invited Mary to join her for tea in her private quarters, a comfortable apartment on the second floor of the school building. "Tell me about your education so far," Elizabeth said, pouring tea from a delicate china service that seemed impossibly refined in this frontier setting. Mary felt embarrassed by the limitations of her learning. "I can read and write well enough, and I know basic arithmetic, but nothing like what your students are studying." "Education isn't about what you've already learned," Elizabeth said gently. "It's about your capacity and desire to continue learning. From what Caleb tells me, you have both in abundance." Mary found herself confiding in Elizabeth about her love of reading, her curiosity about the world beyond Copper Ridge, and her growing realization that life might hold more possibilities than she had ever dared to imagine. "Mary," Elizabeth said after listening thoughtfully to her responses, "I'd like to make you an offer. If you're interested, and if Caleb approves, you could remain here and become one of my students." The suggestion took Mary completely by surprise. "You mean leave Caleb's cabin and live here at the school?" "Yes, you would study alongside my other pupils, receive a comprehensive education that would prepare you for whatever future you choose to pursue." Elizabeth paused, studying Mary's face carefully. but only if it's what you truly want. This kind of learning requires dedication and hard work. Mary's mind raced with the implications of such an offer. To study here would mean opportunities she had never dreamed possible, not just literacy and basic skills, but real education that could open doors to futures she couldn't even imagine yet. "What does Caleb think of this idea?" Mary asked. "Why don't you ask him yourself?" Elizabeth suggested. "He's been waiting in my office while we talked." When Mary joined Caleb in Elizabeth's office, she found him standing before a window that looked out over the school's grounds, where several students were engaged in what appeared to be a geography lesson, using the landscape itself as their classroom. "Elizabeth told you about her offer?" he asked without turning around. "Yes. What do you think I should do?" Caleb turned to face her, and Mary was surprised to see something that looked like sadness in his expression. "I think you should do whatever will give you the best chance at the kind of life you deserve. But what about our arrangement? You paid my mother's debts, and I'm supposed to work for you." "Mary," Caleb said gently, "I didn't bring you to my cabin to keep you there. I brought you there to keep you safe until something better came along." He gestured toward the window and the students beyond. "This is better." Mary felt tears prick her eyes at the kindness in his words, but also confusion about what this change would mean for her relationship with her mother. "What about Mama? She'll expect me to return to Copper Ridge eventually." "Your mother wants what's best for you," Caleb said. "When she understands what this opportunity means, she'll want you to take it." Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, having given them time for their private conversation. "You don't have to decide immediately," she said. "Why don't you stay for a few days, attend some classes, see how you feel about the work involved?" Mary looked between these two people, who seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare, offering her choices she had never expected to have. The scared, desperate girl who had left Copper Ridge just weeks ago could never have imagined standing in this comfortable office, being offered the kind of education that could transform her entire future. "I'd like to try," she said quietly, "if you're both certain it's the right thing." "I'm certain," Elizabeth said firmly. "So am I," Caleb added. "But Mary, I want you to understand something important. Whether you stay here or return to my cabin, whether you eventually go back to your mother or choose some completely different path, you'll always have a place in my family. Elizabeth and I lost our younger sister years ago, but we've found something precious in you." Mary felt overwhelmed by the generosity of his words, by the unexpected gift of belonging these siblings were offering her. She thought of her doll, still carefully tucked away in her belongings back at Caleb's cabin, and realized that while she would always treasure the memories of her childhood, she was ready to begin the work of becoming someone new. That evening, as she sat in the school's library working through a Latin primer under Elizabeth's patient guidance, Mary heard the sound of a bell ringing across the campus. It was the school bell, calling students to evening study time, but to Mary, it sounded like something else entirely, like the ringing of opportunity, of futures being called into existence through the simple act of learning. Outside the library windows, snow continued to fall on the mountain landscape, but Mary no longer felt the cold as a threat. Instead, it felt like protection, like the wilderness itself was creating a sanctuary where young people could grow into whatever they were meant to become. When Caleb appeared in the library doorway to check on her progress, Mary looked up from her books with shining eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For seeing something in me that I didn't know was there." Caleb smiled, one of those rare, genuine expressions that transformed his weathered features. "I didn't see something that wasn't already there, Mary. I just saw something that needed the right conditions to grow." As Mary returned to her studies, she felt the truth of his words settling into her heart. She was still the same girl who had left Copper Ridge in fear and desperation, but she was also becoming someone new, someone with possibilities stretching ahead like the endless mountain ranges beyond the school's windows. The schoolhouse bell had rung for her, and she was ready to answer its call. 3 days later, as Caleb prepared to return to his cabin, Mary had made her decision. She would remain at Elizabeth's school, at least through the winter, to see what kind of student she might become. The prospect both thrilled and terrified her, but she was learning that the best opportunities often came wrapped in uncertainty. "I'll write to your mother," Caleb promised as he secured his pack to his saddle. "I'll explain everything: the school, Elizabeth's offer, your decision to stay. She needs to understand that this isn't abandonment, but advancement." Mary nodded, though she worried about how Clara would receive such news. Would her mother feel betrayed, as if Mary had chosen strangers over family? Or would she understand that education represented the kind of future neither of them could have imagined just months ago? "What if she wants me to come home?" Mary asked. "Then we'll discuss it when that time comes," Caleb replied. "But I believe your mother will recognize this opportunity for what it is: a chance for you to build a life better than anything Copper Ridge could offer." As they stood together in the school's courtyard, Mary felt the weight of all the changes that had brought her to this moment. 2 months ago, she had been a frightened child facing the loss of everything familiar. Now she was a young woman preparing to embrace challenges she had never dreamed possible. "Caleb," she said quietly, "why did you really take me from my mother? The truth, not just the story about needing domestic help." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as if looking back through years of memory. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of old pain, carefully examined and understood. "I told you I had a sister who died young. What I didn't tell you was how she died." He paused, seeming to gather strength for the telling. "Her name was Sarah. She was 12 when our parents succumbed to cholera. I was 18, Elizabeth was 22, and we thought we could manage on our own." Mary waited, sensing that this story held the key to understanding everything that had happened since that day in her mother's cabin. "We had a little money saved, enough to get by for a while. But winter came early that year, and there were expenses we hadn't anticipated. Sarah fell ill, nothing serious at first, just a cough that wouldn't go away. But we couldn't afford the medicine the doctor prescribed." Caleb's voice grew quieter, and Mary could see the pain this memory still caused him. "Elizabeth wanted to sell our mother's jewelry to pay for Sarah's care. I was proud, stubborn. I insisted we could manage without charity, without sacrificing family heirlooms. I believed I could find work, earn what we needed." He shook his head slowly. "By the time I swallowed my pride, it was too late. Sarah died not because there was no help available, but because we were too poor to afford it, and I was too proud to accept assistance." Mary felt tears stinging her eyes as she understood the connection between his sister's tragedy and her own family's situation. "When I saw you and your mother facing the same choice we had faced, pride versus survival, I couldn't let another child suffer for decisions made by desperate adults." Caleb met her eyes directly. "I wasn't really helping you, Mary. I was trying to save Sarah, 20 years too late." The honesty of his confession took Mary's breath away. She had suspected there was more to his motivation than simple kindness, but she hadn't imagined the depth of personal loss that drove his actions. "I'm sorry about Sarah," she said quietly. "So am I. But her death taught Elizabeth and me something valuable about the importance of education and opportunity. Elizabeth dedicated her life to ensuring other children had chances Sarah never got. I chose a different path, but with the same goal." Mary looked around the school courtyard, at the students moving between buildings with books under their arms and purposes in their steps. "This place exists because of Sarah, doesn't it?" "In part, yes. Elizabeth established this school to honor our sister's memory, and now you're here, getting the education Sarah never had the chance to receive." As Caleb mounted his horse and prepared to ride back into the mountains, Mary felt the full circle of tragedy and redemption that had brought her to this moment. What had begun as her family's crisis had become part of a larger story about loss and hope, about the ways people could honor the dead by serving the living. "I'll make the most of this opportunity," Mary promised. "I know you will," Caleb replied. And Mary remembered that learning isn't just about acquiring knowledge, it's about developing the wisdom to use that knowledge in service of others. After Caleb disappeared into the forest, Mary threw herself into her studies with a dedication that impressed even Elizabeth. She attended every class, completed every assignment, and spent her evenings in the library reading beyond what was required. The other students, initially curious about the new girl who had arrived mid-term, soon accepted her as one of their own. Mary's favorite subject quickly became literature, where she discovered authors who wrote about women with agency and intelligence, characters who shaped their own destinies rather than simply accepting whatever fate offered them. Under Elizabeth's guidance, she read novels by female authors who had carved out careers in a world that often dismissed women's intellectual capabilities. Education is particularly important for women, Elizabeth explained during one of their private tutoring sessions. Society may try to limit our opportunities, but no one can take away what we've learned or limit how we choose to use that knowledge. Mathematics proved more challenging for Mary, but Elizabeth's patient instruction gradually revealed the logic and beauty underlying even the most complex calculations. Science opened entirely new ways of understanding the natural world that surrounded the school, transforming Mary's daily walks through the forest into lessons about botany, geology, and animal behavior. But perhaps most valuable were the lessons in critical thinking that Elizabeth wove throughout all subjects. She encouraged students to question assumptions, to examine evidence, to form their own conclusions, rather than simply accepting received wisdom. The mark of an educated person, Elizabeth often said, is not what they know, but how they think about what they don't yet know. One evening, as Mary worked in the library on an essay about the economic factors that drove westward expansion, she discovered a small wooden box tucked behind some reference books. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, was a military medal, bronze and weathered, with a ribbon that had once been bright blue, but was now faded with age. "That belonged to Caleb," Elizabeth said quietly, appearing beside Mary's table. Mary studied the medal carefully, noting the inscription that read, "For valor in the face of enemy fire," and a date from the war between the states. He was a soldier, a captain in the Union Army. He served with distinction, earned several commendations for his leadership and courage under fire. Elizabeth settled into the chair across from Mary. The war changed him, as it changed so many men. When he came home, he found it difficult to adjust to civilian life, to the petty concerns and social expectations of peacetime. Mary thought about the man who had shown her such kindness, trying to reconcile this image with that of a battle-tested military officer. Is that why he went to the mountains? Partly. Caleb needed space to heal from what he'd seen and done during the war, but he also needed a way to channel his protective instincts into something constructive. Elizabeth smiled sadly. Taking care of you, ensuring you had opportunities for education and growth that gave him a sense of purpose he'd been missing since Sarah died. Mary carefully rewrapped the medal and returned it to its hiding place. He saved me, didn't he? Not just from poverty, but from a life without possibilities. You saved each other, Elizabeth said gently. You gave him a chance to honor Sarah's memory in a meaningful way. He gave you the opportunity to discover your own potential. That night, Mary wrote her first letter to her mother since arriving at the school. She tried to explain everything, the beauty of the Mountain Academy, Elizabeth's incredible teaching, the subjects she was studying, the dreams that were beginning to take shape in her mind. But most importantly, she tried to convey that she hadn't forgotten or abandoned her mother, that education was expanding rather than replacing her capacity for love and loyalty. As she sealed the letter, Mary reflected on how much had changed since that desperate winter day when Clara had made an impossible choice. What had seemed like the end of their family's story was revealing itself to be a new beginning, not just for Mary, but potentially for Clara as well. Looking out her dormitory window at the snow-covered peaks surrounding the school, Mary felt a deep sense of gratitude for the chain of events that had brought her here. Caleb's painful loss of Sarah had created the compassion that saved Mary's family. Elizabeth's determination to honor their sister's memory had created this sanctuary for learning, and Mary's own willingness to embrace uncertainty had opened doors she never could have imagined. The military medal hidden in the library spoke of courage in battle, but Mary was learning that there were many kinds of courage. Sometimes bravery meant charging into enemy fire. Sometimes it meant a widow making an impossible choice to save her child. Sometimes it meant a mountain man offering help to strangers because he couldn't save his own sister. And sometimes it meant a 14-year-old girl choosing to believe in possibilities larger than anything her previous life had shown her. As Mary drifted off to sleep in her narrow bed in the school dormitory, surrounded by the quiet breathing of other young women pursuing their own dreams of education and advancement, she felt profoundly grateful for all the different kinds of courage that had converged to bring her here. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, new opportunities to grow into whoever she was meant to become. And for the first time since her father's death, Mary looked forward to tomorrow with hope rather than fear. When Caleb returned to Copper Ridge with news of Mary's educational opportunity, he found the town buzzing with whispered speculation about what had really happened to Clara Hensley's daughter. Some folks assumed the worst, that the mountain man had done away with the girl and was now returning to cover his tracks. Others suggested she had tried to escape and died in the wilderness. The kindest rumors merely supposed that she had proven unsuitable for domestic work and been sent away in disgrace. Clara herself had endured weeks of pitying looks and carefully avoided conversations. The women of the town treated her as if she were in mourning, while the men regarded her with the particular discomfort that decent people felt when forced to contemplate desperate choices. Morrison had been decent enough to spread word that Clara's debt was fully settled, but even this kindness carried an undertone of judgment about the price she had paid. When Caleb rode down Main Street toward Clara's cabin, leading Mary's horse, but notably without Mary herself, the town's attention focused on him with laser intensity. He could feel the weight of their stares, hear the sudden hush that fell over normal conversation as people stopped to witness whatever revelation was about to unfold. Clara was hanging laundry on a line behind her cabin when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. The past month had aged her, visibly, her face drawn with worry, her movements carrying the careful precision of someone trying to maintain dignity under impossible circumstances. When she saw Caleb approaching alone, her hands stilled on the clothesline, and her face went pale with fear. "Mrs. Hensley," Caleb said, dismounting and removing his hat with careful courtesy. "Where is she?" Clara's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried all the anguish of a mother, expecting the worst possible news. "She's safe," Caleb said quickly, seeing the terror in her eyes. "More than safe. She's thriving." Clara's knees seemed to give way slightly, and she gripped the clothesline for support. "Then why isn't she with you?" "Because she's found something better than what I could offer her. Something that will change her life in ways we never dared imagine." Caleb reached into his coat and withdrew a thick bundle of letters, tied with ribbon correspondence between himself and Elizabeth, that detailed their family history and the true reasons behind his offer to help Mary. He handed the bundle to Clara with the solemnity of someone passing along sacred documents. "These letters will explain everything," he said. "But the simple truth is this. I never intended to keep Mary as a servant. I intended to give her opportunities that her circumstances had made impossible." Clara's hands shook as she untied the ribbon and began to read the topmost letter. It was written in Elizabeth's careful script and addressed to Caleb, dated several months before Mary had ever come to his attention. "My dear brother," the letter began, "I continue to believe that Sarah's death was not meaningless if we can use our grief to prevent other children from suffering similar fates. The school is thriving, but I find myself thinking often about the children we never reach, those whose families face the same impossible choices we once confronted. If you encounter situations where education might provide salvation that charity cannot, please remember that we have resources to help." Clara looked up at Caleb with growing understanding. "You planned this from the beginning?" "Not exactly, But when I heard about your situation through Morrison's complaints about unpaid debts, I remembered Elizabeth's words. I saw an opportunity to do for your family what no one had been able to do for mine. Clara continued reading, working her way through letters that revealed the full scope of Caleb and Elizabeth's shared mission. She learned about Sarah's death from poverty and neglect, about Elizabeth's decision to dedicate her life to education as a form of memorial, about Caleb's choice to use his mountain solitude as a way of identifying families in crisis. "You were never a mountain man at all, were you?" Clara asked, looking up from a letter that mentioned Caleb's teaching background and military service. "I am now," Caleb replied, "but you're right that it wasn't my original calling. I taught school in Ohio before the war, served as a captain during the conflict, and tried to return to teaching afterward. But I found that peace required different skills than I possessed at the time." Clara read on, discovering that Caleb had been quietly helping families throughout the territory for years, not by providing charity, which often wounded pride and created dependency, but by creating opportunities for self-improvement and advancement. The final letter in the bundle was from Mary herself, written in her careful script, but with a confidence that Clara had never seen before. Mary described her studies at Elizabeth's school, her growing love of literature and learning, her plans to continue her education and perhaps become a teacher herself one day. "She's happy," Clara said, and it wasn't quite a question but carried a note of wonder. "She's discovering what she's capable of becoming," Caleb confirmed. Elizabeth believes Mary has exceptional potential, given proper guidance and opportunity. Clara wiped tears from her eyes as she absorbed the full magnitude of what these revelations meant. Her desperate bargain had not condemned her daughter to servitude or worse, but had opened doors to possibilities that exceeded anything Clara could have hoped for. "Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning?" she asked. "Because desperate people sometimes make poor decisions when they're offered hope they don't believe they deserve," Caleb said gently. "You needed to believe that you were sacrificing for Mary's immediate safety. If I had told you the real plan, you might have refused, thinking it was too good to be true." Clara nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in his approach. In her state of desperation, an offer of education and opportunity would have seemed like false hope, too generous to be real. But the crude bargain of domestic service in exchange for debt payment had felt believable, even if terrible. "What happens now?" Clara asked. "That depends on what you want to happen," Caleb replied. "Mary can continue her education at Elizabeth's school with our full support, for as long as she chooses. Or she can return to you here in Copper Ridge whenever you both decide that's best." Clara looked around at her small cabin, at the town beyond, where people were undoubtedly watching this conversation with intense curiosity, at the limited possibilities that comprised her daughter's future if she remained in this place. "She should stay at the school," Clara said finally. "As long as they'll have her, she should stay and learn everything they can teach her." "And what about you?" Caleb asked. "Elizabeth mentioned in her last letter that the school could use someone to help with the younger children, someone with maternal instincts and practical experience. It wouldn't pay much, but it would provide room and board, and it would let you be near Mary while she completes her education." Clara stared at him in amazement. "You're offering me work at the school as well?" "I'm offering you the chance to be part of your daughter's education rather than separated from it," Caleb said. "But only if that's what you want. There's no pressure, no obligation based on the arrangement we made before." Clara felt overwhelmed by the generosity of these options, by the way this man and his sister had transformed her family's crisis into opportunities neither she nor Mary could have imagined. But beyond gratitude, she felt something else, a stirring of her own possibilities, her own potential for growth and contribution. "I'd like to see the school," she said quietly. "I'd like to understand what Mary's life there looks like before I make any decisions." "Of course," Caleb agreed. "We can leave whenever you're ready." As Clara went inside to pack a few belongings for the journey, she thought about the conversation she would need to have with Morrison and the other townspeople who had witnessed her desperate bargain months ago. They deserved to know the truth about what had happened to Mary, about the kind of man Caleb Stroud really was beneath his fearsome reputation. But more than that, Clara realized, this revelation would force the entire town to confront their own assumptions about charity, opportunity, and the ways people helped each other in times of crisis. Caleb's approach, offering advancement rather than assistance, education rather than charity, challenged conventional thinking about how communities should respond to families in distress. When Clara emerged from her cabin with her traveling bag, she found a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, drawn by curiosity about this unexpected development in the Hensley family saga. Morrison stood among them, his face showing the particular discomfort of a man who realized he might have seriously misjudged a situation. "Mrs. Hensley," Morrison called out, "is everything all right? Where's your daughter?" Clara looked at Caleb, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, Clara addressed the assembled townspeople with more confidence than she had felt in months. "Mary is at school," she said clearly. "Mr. Stroud arranged for her to receive a proper education at his sister's academy in the mountains. She's safe, she's learning, and she's happier than I've seen her since her father died." A murmur ran through the crowd as people processed this unexpected information. Clara could see the skepticism on some faces, the surprise on others, and the dawning comprehension on a few. "Mr. Stroud," Morrison said, addressing Caleb directly, "the reputation you have in this town is based on assumptions rather than facts." Caleb replied calmly, "I've never claimed to be anything other than what I am. A man who values education and believes in helping families find their own solutions to difficult circumstances." Clara climbed onto her horse, noting how different this departure felt from the one that had taken Mary away months ago. Then she had been saying goodbye in despair, uncertain whether she would ever see her daughter again. Now she was riding toward reunion and possibility, toward a future that might hold opportunities for both mother and daughter. As they rode out of Copper Ridge, Clara reflected on the bundle of letters, now tucked safely in her saddlebag, evidence of a larger story about loss and redemption, about the ways people could honor the dead by serving the living. Sarah Stroud's death had been transformed into something meaningful through her siblings' dedication to preventing other children from suffering similar fates. "Caleb," Clara said as they entered the forest trail that led toward the mountains, "thank you for seeing possibilities in our situation that I was too frightened and desperate to imagine." "Thank you for trusting me with Mary's welfare," Caleb replied, "and for being brave enough to make an impossible choice when it seemed like the only option available." Clara thought about that characterization as they rode through the snow-covered pines. She had felt anything but brave that winter day when she had agreed to Caleb's proposal. But perhaps bravery wasn't about feeling fearless. Perhaps it was about acting in spite of fear when the welfare of those you loved was at stake. The bundle of letters in her saddlebag told the story of multiple kinds of courage. Sarah's struggle against poverty and illness, Elizabeth's determination to honor her sister's memory through education, Caleb's choice to transform his own loss into service to others, and Mary's willingness to embrace an unknown future. Now Clara was discovering her own form of courage, the willingness to believe that her story might not be ending but transforming, that the desperate choices of winter might bloom into the possibilities of spring. The reunion between Clara and Mary took place in Elizabeth's private study, a room lined with books and warmed by a fire that cast dancing shadows on the walls. When Mary looked up from her Latin translations and saw her mother standing in the doorway, the carefully composed young scholar disappeared, replaced by a 14-year-old girl who had missed her mother desperately. "Mama," Mary whispered, rising from her chair with tears already streaming down her face. Clara crossed the room in 3 quick steps, and then they were holding each other with the fierce intensity of people who had feared they might never embrace again. For several minutes, neither spoke, content simply to reassure themselves that they were both real, both safe, both changed, but somehow still fundamentally themselves. "Let me look at you," Clara said finally, holding Mary at arm's length to study her daughter's face. The changes were subtle but significant. Mary carried herself with new confidence, her eyes bright with intellectual curiosity that hadn't been there before. Even her posture spoke of someone who had discovered her own capabilities. "You look different too, Mama," Mary said, studying Clara's face with equal intensity. "Stronger, somehow." Clara supposed that was true. The desperate, fearful woman who had made an impossible bargain with a stranger had been replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the most frightening choices led to the most extraordinary outcomes. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, giving them time to complete their initial reunion before intruding with practical matters. "Mary's been working on a presentation about her educational goals," she said gently. "Perhaps she could share it with you while I prepare some tea." Mary's presentation proved to be far more sophisticated than anything Clara could have imagined her daughter capable of just months earlier. Using charts and references to texts Clara had never heard of, Mary outlined her plans to continue her education through secondary school and possibly pursue higher learning after that. "I want to become a teacher," Mary explained, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had discovered her true calling. "Like Elizabeth, I want to bring education to children who might not otherwise have access to it." Clara listened with growing amazement as Mary detailed her academic progress, her favorite subjects, and her plans for the future. This was no longer the frightened girl who had left Copper Ridge in desperation, but a young woman with clear goals and the skills to achieve them. "Elizabeth says, I have a natural aptitude for languages," Mary continued, showing Clara her work in Latin and the beginning French texts she had started studying. "She thinks I could eventually teach multiple subjects, perhaps even establish a school of my own someday." The scope of Mary's ambitions took Clara's breath away. In the space of just a few months, her daughter had gone from facing an uncertain future to planning a career that could impact countless other children's lives. When Elizabeth returned with tea, she carried with her a thick folder that she placed on the desk between Clara and Mary. "These are Mary's academic evaluations," Elizabeth explained. "I wanted you to see the remarkable progress she's made and to understand the full extent of her potential." Clara opened the folder to find pages of detailed assessments written in Elizabeth's careful handwriting. "Mathematics shows exceptional problem-solving abilities and intuitive grasp of complex concepts. Literature demonstrates sophisticated analytical thinking and natural gift for written expression. Natural sciences displays genuine curiosity and methodical approach to observation and experimentation." But it was the summary evaluation that brought tears to Clara's eyes. Mary Hensley possesses the intellectual capacity and moral character necessary for advanced education and professional achievement. With continued support and guidance, she could become a significant contributor to educational advancement in the Western Territories. Her natural empathy, combined with her growing academic skills, suggests she could be particularly effective in reaching children from disadvantaged backgrounds. "She wrote that about our Mary?" Clara asked, looking up at Elizabeth with wonder. "She wrote that about the young woman Mary has become," Elizabeth corrected gently. "The potential was always there, Clara. It just needed the right environment to flourish." That evening, as the three women sat before the fire in Elizabeth's living quarters, Clara found herself contemplating the offer Caleb had mentioned, the possibility of remaining at the school to help with the younger children while Mary completed her education. "What would that work involve exactly?" Clara asked Elizabeth. "The younger students ages 6 through 10 need more individual attention than I can provide, while also teaching the advanced classes," Elizabeth explained. "They need someone with maternal instincts to help them adjust to being away from home, to assist with basic skills, and to provide the emotional support that's so crucial at that age." Clara thought about her own experience with children, her natural ability to comfort and guide young ones. It wasn't the same as formal education, but perhaps it was a different kind of teaching, equally valuable in its own way. You wouldn't need extensive academic preparation, Elizabeth continued. What you'd bring is life experience, wisdom about raising children, and the kind of nurturing presence that makes learning possible for students who are struggling with homesickness or fear. Mary looked up from the book she'd been reading. Mama, you'd be wonderful at that kind of work. You always knew exactly what to say when I was frightened or confused. Clara felt a familiar flutter of possibility, the same sensation she'd experienced when she first understood that Caleb's offer might be salvation rather than tragedy. Could she really reinvent herself at this stage of life? Could she become part of an educational institution, contributing to something larger than her own survival? There's something else I should mention, Elizabeth said carefully. Several of our students come from situations similar to what you and Mary faced, families disrupted by death, economic hardship, or other crises. Your experience, your understanding of what it means to make difficult choices for a child's welfare, would be invaluable in helping these families navigate their options. Clara realized that Elizabeth was offering her more than just employment. She was offering the chance to help other parents facing impossible decisions, to be part of the solution that had saved her own family. The next morning brought Mary's first formal presentation to the entire school, a recitation she had prepared on the importance of education for women in the developing territories. Clara sat in the back of the classroom, watching with pride as her daughter stood before her fellow students and spoke with confidence about opportunities and responsibilities. Education, Mary concluded, is not just about personal advancement. It's about developing the capacity to serve others, to contribute to the building of communities where every child has the chance to discover their potential. The words were Mary's own, but Clara could hear echoes of Elizabeth's teaching and Caleb's quiet wisdom in the sentiment. Her daughter was learning not just academic subjects, but a philosophy of service that would guide her entire approach to life. After the presentation, Clara found herself approached by several other parents who had come to visit their children at the school. They wanted to know about her experience with Mary's education, about the decision to allow her daughter to remain at the academy rather than return home. It wasn't easy, Clara admitted to a mother whose 8-year-old son was struggling with homesickness, but I realized that holding on to Mary too tightly would have limited her possibilities. Sometimes love means giving children the freedom to become more than we ever imagined they could be. These conversations reinforced Clara's growing sense that she might indeed have something valuable to offer other families, other children who needed advocates and support during difficult transitions. That afternoon, Caleb returned from checking his trap lines to find the 3 women deep in discussion about Clara's potential role at the school. He listened quietly as they outlined the possibilities, the challenges, and the ways such an arrangement might benefit both Clara and the institution. "What do you think?" Clara asked him directly. "You've been part of this mission longer than any of us. Do you believe I could contribute meaningfully to what you and Elizabeth are trying to accomplish?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, studying Clara's face with the same careful assessment he'd used when first evaluating her situation months ago. "I think," he said finally, "that you've already proven your capacity for difficult decisions and meaningful sacrifice. The question isn't whether you're capable of this work, but whether it's what you truly want to do." Clara thought about that question as they prepared for the evening meal. What did she truly want? For so long, her desires had been constrained by circumstances, by the need to simply survive from one day to the next. But now, with security and possibilities opening before her, she could consider what kind of life she actually wanted to build. Looking around the school's dining hall, watching students from across the territory sharing meals and ideas, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. A sense of belonging to something larger than her own immediate concerns. "I want to be part of this," she said quietly to Elizabeth as they helped serve dinner to the younger students. "I want to help other families find their way to opportunities, like the ones you've given Mary and me." Elizabeth smiled, handing Clara a stack of plates. "Then welcome to the faculty, Mrs. Hensley. I have a feeling you're going to discover talents you never knew you possessed." That night, as Clara lay in the guest quarters Elizabeth had provided, she listened to the sounds of the school settling into evening quiet, students finishing their studies, teachers preparing for the next day's lessons, the wind moving through the pines that surrounded their mountain sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring the formal beginning of her new life, her transformation from desperate widow to educational advocate. It felt like both an ending and a beginning, the close of one chapter and the opening of another, in a story that had turned out to be far more complex and hopeful than she had ever dared imagine. Outside her window, the same mountains that had once seemed like barriers to civilization now felt like protection, sheltering a community dedicated to the revolutionary idea that every child deserved the chance to learn, to grow, to become whatever their talents and dedication could make possible. Clara pulled her quilt closer and smiled in the darkness, thinking about the report card that would soon arrive, documenting not just Mary's academic progress, but the transformation of an entire family's destiny. Spring arrived at the mountain school with the gradual intensity of seasons changing in high country first, as a whisper of warmth in the afternoon sun. Then, as the musical sound of snowmelt rushing down the mountainsides, and finally, as the explosive green of new growth pushing through the last patches of winter snow. For Mary, spring brought her first major academic milestone, the school's annual presentation evening, where students demonstrated their learning to an audience of parents, community members, and potential benefactors who traveled from as far away as Denver to witness Elizabeth's educational experiment in action. Mary had chosen to present a piece she had written about the role of education in developing the Western Territories. But as the date approached, she found herself wanting to share something more personal, the story of how education had transformed not just her own possibilities, but her family's entire understanding of what life could offer. "I want Caleb to be there," Mary told Elizabeth as they planned the evening's program. "And I want the people from Copper Ridge to see what really happened to me." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow at this unexpected request. "Are you certain? Presenting to strangers is one thing, but sharing your story with people who knew your previous circumstances, that requires a different kind of courage." Mary thought about this for a moment, fingering the small wooden cross that Caleb had carved for her as a Christmas gift. The simple pendant had become her talisman, a reminder of the unexpected kindness that had changed everything. "I think people need to understand that sometimes what looks like tragedy is actually the beginning of something wonderful," Mary said. "Maybe if they hear our story, other families won't be afraid to accept help when they need it." Clara, who had been working with the younger students in the next room, appeared in the doorway. In the months since she had joined the school staff, she had developed into exactly the kind of teacher Elizabeth had envisioned, someone whose life experience gave weight to her gentle guidance, whose understanding of hardship made her particularly effective with children facing their own difficulties. "What's this about people from Copper Ridge?" Clara asked, settling into a chair beside Mary's desk. "I want to invite them to the presentation evening," Mary explained. "Mr. Morrison, some of the other townspeople. I want them to see what Caleb really did for us." Clara exchanged a look with Elizabeth that spoke of shared understanding about the courage this decision represented. Both women had learned that Mary possessed not just academic intelligence, but the moral clarity that made her willing to use her own story in service of larger principles. "That's a generous impulse," Clara said carefully. "But are you prepared for their questions, their judgment? Some of those people still believe I made a terrible mistake by trusting Caleb with your welfare." "Then they need to learn the truth," Mary replied with the quiet determination that had become her trademark. "And maybe hearing our story will help them see other situations differently." The invitation that went out to Copper Ridge created quite a stir. Morrison, in particular, seemed torn between curiosity about Mary's fate and discomfort about his own role in creating the crisis that had led to her departure. But in the end, a small delegation from the town agreed to make the journey to witness Mary's presentation. On the evening itself, the school's main hall was transformed with candles and spring flowers, creating an atmosphere that managed to be both festive and solemn. Parents and visitors filled chairs arranged in careful rows, while students waited nervously backstage for their turns to demonstrate months of learning and growth. Clara sat in the front row, watching Mary prepare for her presentation with a mixture of pride and amazement. Her daughter had chosen to wear the blue wool dress Caleb had purchased for her during those first days at his cabin, but she had added touches that spoke of her own developing sense of style, a ribbon in her hair, the wooden cross at her throat, and an air of confidence that transformed simple clothing into something elegant. When Mary's turn came, she walked to the front of the hall with steady composure, carrying in her hands the rag doll that had traveled with her from Copper Ridge to Caleb's cabin to this moment of triumph. The sight of the childhood toy in this sophisticated academic setting created a stir of recognition among the visitors from her hometown. "Good evening," Mary began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "My name is Mary Hensley, and I'm here tonight to tell you a story about the difference between charity and opportunity, between rescue and education, between what looks like an ending and what turns out to be a beginning." She paused, making eye contact with Morrison and the other visitors from Copper Ridge before continuing. "Less than a year ago, my mother faced an impossible choice. We were drowning in debt after my father's death, facing eviction from our home with no apparent options for survival. When a man offered to take me in exchange for paying our debts, most people assumed we were trading my future for temporary relief." Mary held up the doll, its button eyes catching the candlelight. "I brought this with me that day because it was the last gift my father ever gave me, and I was terrified that I might never see anything familiar again. What I couldn't have imagined was that I was actually traveling toward the most extraordinary opportunity of my life." Clara felt tears beginning to gather in her eyes as Mary continued, describing not just the facts of her educational experience, but the transformation of her understanding about what was possible for a girl from a struggling frontier family. "Caleb Stroud didn't save me from my circumstances," Mary said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He gave me the tools to save myself and to help save others. Education isn't just about learning facts or mastering skills. It's about developing the capacity to see possibilities where others see only problems." Mary went on to describe the school, Elizabeth's teaching methods, and her own academic progress. But more than that, she talked about the community they had built, students from diverse backgrounds learning together, families finding support during difficult transitions, and the ripple effects of educational opportunity extending far beyond individual achievement. "Tonight, I want to thank 3 people publicly," Mary said as her presentation neared its conclusion. "My mother, Clara Hensley, who had the courage to make an impossible choice because she loved me more than she feared losing me." Clara wiped her eyes, overwhelmed by the generosity of Mary's acknowledgement. "Elizabeth Stroud, who proved that one person's dedication to education can change countless lives, and who showed me that learning is not just a privilege, but a responsibility." Elizabeth smiled from her seat among the faculty, clearly moved by Mary's words. "And Caleb Stroud, who understood that sometimes helping someone means not giving them what they think they need, but helping them discover what they're capable of achieving." Mary paused, scanning the audience until she found Caleb sitting quietly in the back row, his weathered face showing the same careful neutrality he brought to most public occasions. Caleb saw possibilities in our situation that we were too frightened and desperate to imagine. He honored the memory of his own lost sister by ensuring that I would have chances she never got. And in doing so, he taught me that the best way to deal with loss is to make sure it leads to something meaningful. The applause that followed Mary's presentation was sustained and heartfelt, but Clara noticed that the visitors from Copper Ridge seemed subdued, clearly processing the implications of what they had heard. After the formal presentations concluded and the reception began, Morrison approached Clara with obvious discomfort. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, removing his hat and twisting it in his hands, "I owe you an apology. When I pressured you about that debt, when I brought Stroud to your cabin with his proposal, I thought I was just conducting business. I never realized. You couldn't have known," Clara interrupted gently. "None of us could have known what would grow from that terrible situation. But I should have been more patient, more understanding of your circumstances," Morrison insisted. "A widow with a young daughter deserved better consideration than I gave you." Clara looked across the reception hall, where Mary was engaged in animated conversation with other students and their families, clearly in her element among people who valued learning and intellectual curiosity. "Mr. Morrison," Clara said quietly, "if you had been more patient, if you hadn't created the crisis that forced us to accept Caleb's help, Mary might never have found her way to this opportunity. Sometimes the things that seem cruel or unfair in the moment turn out to be exactly what we needed." As the evening wound down and visitors began their journeys back to their respective homes, Clara found herself standing outside the school building with Caleb, looking up at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear mountain air. "She did well tonight," Caleb said simply. "She did more than well," Clara replied. "She used her story to teach other people about possibilities they might not have considered. That's what you and Elizabeth have given her, not just education, but the confidence to believe her voice matters." Caleb was quiet for a moment, and Clara thought she saw something that might have been satisfaction in his expression. "Sarah would have been proud," he said finally. "Sarah would have been proud of all of you," Clara corrected, "of the way you turned your loss into service, your grief into opportunity for others." As they stood together in the peaceful silence of the mountain night, Clara reflected on the strange journey that had brought them all to this moment. What had begun as her family's darkest hour had become a story of transformation and hope that would now be carried back to Copper Ridge and beyond by the people who had witnessed Mary's presentation. The wooden cross that Mary wore around her neck caught the moonlight as she emerged from the school building, and Clara was struck by the perfect symbolism of the moment. Caleb's simple gift represented everything. Their story was really about faith in possibilities that couldn't be seen, hope that endured through difficult circumstances, and love that manifested not in holding on tightly, but in letting go, when letting go meant growth. The morning after Mary's presentation, Caleb approached Clara with a document that would formalize everything their unusual arrangement had become. It was a deed to a small plot of land adjacent to the school property, enough space for a modest house where Clara could live permanently while continuing her work with the younger students. "I don't understand," Clara said, staring at the legal document with her name written in careful script. "You're giving me land? I'm ensuring that you and Mary have a permanent place in this community," Caleb replied, "if you choose to accept it. Elizabeth and I have discussed this extensively. We want you to know that your contribution here is valued enough to make it permanent." Clara walked to the window of Elizabeth's office, looking out at the plot Caleb had indicated. It was a beautiful spot, sheltered by pines but open enough for a garden, with a clear view of the mountains and convenient proximity to the school buildings. "This is too generous," she said quietly. "You've already given us so much." "Clara," Elizabeth said, joining the conversation, "in the months you've been here, you've helped a dozen families navigate difficult decisions about their children's education. You've provided exactly the kind of support that makes our work possible. This isn't charity, it's recognition of value received." Clara thought about the families she had worked with, parents facing their own versions of the impossible choice she had once confronted. There had been the mining family, whose son needed medical attention that could only be found in larger towns, but who also showed exceptional mathematical ability. Clara had helped them understand that sending the boy to school didn't mean abandoning him, but rather giving him tools that might eventually help his entire family. Then there was the widow, whose teenage daughter was being courted by a man twice her age, a match that would have solved immediate financial problems but foreclosed on the girl's future possibilities. Clara's conversations with both mother and daughter had led to the girl's enrollment at the school and the discovery of remarkable artistic talents. "I want to accept," Clara said, turning back to face Caleb and Elizabeth. "But I also want to understand what this means for Mary's future. Will she be tied to this place, or free to pursue whatever path her education makes possible?" "Ah, free," Elizabeth said immediately. "That's the entire point of education, to expand choices, not limit them. Mary may choose to stay here and eventually join our faculty, or she may pursue opportunities in larger cities, or she may decide to establish schools in other frontier areas. Whatever she chooses, she'll have the foundation to succeed." Caleb nodded his agreement. "The land, the house, the permanent position, these are about giving you security and options, not creating obligations or limitations." That afternoon, Clara walked the boundaries of her new property with Mary, talking through what this unexpected gift meant for both of them. "Are you happy here, Mama?" Mary asked as they stood where Clara's future house would be built. "Really happy, not just grateful?" Clara considered the question seriously. Happiness had seemed like such a luxury during those desperate months after Thomas's death that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to consider her own contentment rather than just survival. "I am happy," she said finally. "Not just because we're secure now, but because I've found work that feels meaningful. Helping other families understand their options, supporting children through difficult transitions. It feels like I'm using everything I learned from our own experience in service of something larger." Mary smiled, and Clara was struck by how much her daughter had matured over the past months. The frightened girl who had left Copper Ridge had been replaced by a young woman with clear goals and the confidence to pursue them. "I want to show you something," Mary said, leading Clara toward the school building. They climbed to the second floor, where Mary had been working on a special project in one of the smaller classrooms. The room had been transformed into what could only be described as a memorial library. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books on education, child development, and frontier life. But at the center of the room stood a simple wooden table with a brass plaque that read, "The Sarah Stroud Memorial Collection." In honor of children whose potential was never realized, and in commitment to ensuring that other children receive the opportunities she was denied. "Elizabeth and I have been working on this for months," Mary explained. "Every book here was chosen because it relates to helping children overcome difficult circumstances. We want it to be a resource for families facing the kinds of decisions you had to make." Clara walked slowly around the room, taking in the careful organization and thoughtful selection of materials. There were practical guides for parents, inspirational stories of children who had overcome adversity, and scholarly works on the importance of education in breaking cycles of poverty and limitation. "This is beautiful," Clara said softly. "Sarah would be honored." "There's something else," Mary said, opening a drawer in the central table. Inside was a leather-bound journal with blank pages, and beside it, a simple wooden penholder carved in the same style as the cross Mary wore around her neck. "We want you to help us document the stories of families who come through the school," Mary explained. "Not just their academic progress, but their journeys from crisis to opportunity. Elizabeth thinks that someday these stories might help other communities understand how to support families in distress." Clara picked up the journal, feeling the weight of smooth leather and empty pages that represented countless stories yet to be told. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work she hadn't known she was capable of until circumstances forced her to discover her own strength. "I'd be honored to take on this responsibility," Clara said. That evening, the four of them, Clara, Mary, Elizabeth, and Caleb, gathered in Elizabeth's private quarters for what had become a weekly tradition. They shared a simple meal and discussed the week's developments, challenges, and successes. It was, Clara realized, the closest thing to family life she had experienced since Thomas's death. "I have news," Elizabeth announced as they finished their meal. "I've received a letter from the Territorial Education Board. They're so impressed with our results here that they want to establish similar schools in 3 other locations. They're asking if we would be willing to train teachers and help establish curricula for these new institutions." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "That's quite an expansion from our original plan." "It's also quite an opportunity," Elizabeth replied. "Think about how many more children we could reach, how many more families we could help navigate difficult circumstances." Mary looked up from the book she had been reading during the adult conversation. "Would that mean some of us would need to travel to these new schools, help them get started?" "Possibly," Elizabeth said. "Advanced students like yourself might serve as teaching assistants, helping younger children while continuing your own education. It would be excellent preparation for your eventual career in education." Clara felt a familiar flutter of possibility mixed with uncertainty. The work they were doing here felt meaningful and successful. Was it wise to expand so quickly, to take on responsibilities that might dilute their effectiveness? "What do you think, Clara?" Caleb asked, as if reading her thoughts. "You've worked with enough families now to understand the scope of need. Could our approach be successfully replicated in other locations?" Clara thought about the parents she had counseled, the children she had helped adjust to school life, the gradual transformation she had witnessed in family after family as education opened new possibilities for their futures. "I think the approach could work anywhere," she said slowly, "but only if each new school has people who truly understand that education is about more than just academic instruction. It's about helping entire families reimagine what's possible for their children." "Exactly," Elizabeth said, leaning forward with enthusiasm. "That's why I think you should be part of the team that helps establish these new schools. Your perspective, your experience with families in crisis, that's invaluable knowledge that can't be learned from books." The conversation continued late into the evening, covering practical considerations about staffing, funding, and curriculum development. But underneath the logistics, Clara sensed something larger taking shape, the possibility that their small mountain school might become the seed for a network of institutions dedicated to transforming educational opportunities throughout the Western Territories. When Clara finally retired to her quarters that night, she sat by her window looking out at the land that would soon hold her new home. The deed lay on her bedside table, legal proof of security she had never expected to possess. But more than the land or the house or even the meaningful work, what struck her was the sense of belonging she had found in this unlikely community. Mary's wooden cross caught the moonlight from where it hung on a peg near her bed, and Clara thought about the faith it represented, not just religious faith, but faith in possibilities that couldn't be seen, trust in the goodness that could emerge from the most difficult circumstances. A year ago, she had been a desperate widow facing impossible choices. Tonight, she was a valued member of an educational community with the opportunity to help shape the future of learning in the developing territories. The transformation seemed almost miraculous, but Clara was beginning to understand that miracles often wore the disguise of ordinary human kindness, extended at exactly the moment when it was needed most. Outside her window, the mountains stood silent and eternal, guardians of the valley, where broken families came to discover that endings could become beginnings, that loss could transform into service, and that the most frightening choices sometimes led to the most extraordinary destinations. 1 year later, Clara stood in the doorway of her new home, watching as a traveling artist put the finishing touches on a family portrait, unlike any that might have been imagined when this story began. The painting showed 4 people seated together in Elizabeth's library, Clara with her gentle smile and work-worn hands, Mary holding a book and wearing her father's cross, Elizabeth radiating the quiet authority that made her such an effective teacher, and Caleb with an expression of contentment that had replaced the loneliness that once defined him. "It's perfect," Mary said, studying the artist's work with the critical eye she had developed through her studies in art appreciation. It captures not just how we look, but who we've become. Together, Clara nodded, marveling at the way the painting told the story of their unconventional but deeply loving family. When visitors to the school saw this portrait in years to come, they would see the evidence of what could grow from the most unlikely beginnings. The past year had brought changes that none of them could have anticipated. Mary had completed her preliminary education with honors and begun teaching assistant duties with the youngest students, discovering that she possessed not just academic intelligence, but the patience and empathy that made her naturally gifted at explaining complex ideas to young minds. Elizabeth's expansion plans had come to fruition, with 2 new schools already established and a third in the planning stages. Clara had spent several months traveling between the new locations, helping train teachers and support staff in the delicate work of counseling families through educational decisions. Caleb had gradually transitioned from his solitary mountain life to become the informal coordinator between the various school locations, using his knowledge of the territory and his growing reputation for integrity to identify families who might benefit from educational opportunities they didn't know existed. Mrs. Hensley called one of the newer students, a 10-year-old boy whose family had arrived just weeks earlier under circumstances remarkably similar to Clara's original situation. "Could you help me with this letter to my father? I want to tell him about the mathematics class, but I don't know how to explain why it's important." Clara smiled, remembering her own struggles to understand Mary's enthusiasm for subjects that had seemed impossibly advanced. "Of course, David, let's work together to find words he'll understand." As she sat with the boy, helping him craft a letter that would reassure his father while conveying his growing excitement about learning, Clara reflected on how naturally this work had come to her. The desperate woman who had once felt powerless to help her own child had discovered gifts for helping other families navigate similar challenges. "The key," Clara explained to David as they worked, "is to help your father see that education isn't taking you away from your family, but giving you tools that might help your entire family in the future." After David left to deliver his letter, Clara returned to her own correspondence, a report she was preparing for the Territorial Education Board about the unique challenges facing frontier families who wanted to provide opportunities for their children. Her writing had improved dramatically over the past year, shaped by Elizabeth's gentle instruction and her own growing confidence in her ability to communicate important ideas. The report documented not just the success stories, but the careful processes that made those successes possible. "Family crisis," Clara wrote, "often creates the desperation necessary for families to consider educational opportunities they might otherwise reject as too risky or too good to be true. Our role is not to exploit that desperation, but to transform it into hope by providing genuine opportunities for advancement." Mary appeared in the doorway, carrying a thick envelope that bore the seal of the territorial government. "This just arrived for you, Mama. It looks official." Clara opened the envelope to find a formal letter, offering her an appointment as Regional Family Education Coordinator, a newly created position that would involve traveling throughout the territory to establish support systems for families seeking educational opportunities for their children. "They want me to help create a network of schools like this one," Clara explained, sharing the letter with Mary. "Not just the academic programs, but the family support services that make it possible for children to succeed away from home." Mary's eyes lit up with excitement. "Mama, this is exactly what you've been preparing for. All the work you've done here, all the families you've helped, this position would let you help hundreds more." Clara felt the familiar flutter of possibility mixed with uncertainty. The work would require extensive travel, time away from the mountain sanctuary that had become home. But it would also mean extending the kind of help that had saved her own family to parents and children throughout the territory. "What do you think?" Clara asked Mary. "Would you be all right if I took on work that required me to travel frequently?" Mary smiled with the confidence that had become her trademark. "Mama, I think Papa would be proud to see how you've grown from someone who needed help into someone who helps others. And besides, I'll be here continuing my own education and my teaching responsibilities. We're both ready for the next chapter of our story." That evening, as the four of them gathered for their weekly family dinner, Clara shared the news of her job offer and her decision to accept it. The conversation that followed was both practical and emotional, covering logistics about travel schedules and deeper questions about how their family would adapt to this new phase. "It's the natural evolution of everything we've been building here," Elizabeth said, raising her glass in a toast. "Clara's going to carry our approach to families throughout the territory, ensuring that what happened to us, the transformation of crisis into opportunity, becomes available to anyone who needs it." Caleb, who had been characteristically quiet during the discussion, finally spoke. "Sarah's death meant something because it led to all of this," he said simply. "Now Clara's work will mean that other children don't face the same choices Sarah did, the same desperate circumstances Mary did." As they continued their conversation, Clara thought about the document that had started everything, the debt notice that had seemed like a death sentence, but had actually been the beginning of new life. That piece of paper was now framed and hanging in the Sarah Stroud Memorial Library, not as a reminder of crisis, but as evidence of how the most frightening moments could become doorways to possibilities no one had imagined. The family portrait was officially unveiled the next morning in a small ceremony attended by students, staff, and several families whose children were enrolled at the school. As Clara looked at the faces gathered around the painting, she saw the living proof of what their work had accomplished: children who might never have had educational opportunities, parents who had discovered that love sometimes meant making choices that felt impossible. Mary gave a brief speech about the painting's significance, explaining how it represented not just their personal family, but the larger family of people committed to ensuring that every child had access to the tools needed to build whatever future their talents and dedication could support. "This portrait," Mary concluded, "shows what's possible when people choose hope over fear, when they believe in possibilities they can't yet see, and when they understand that the most meaningful families are sometimes the ones we choose rather than the ones we're born into." After the ceremony, Clara walked alone to the small cemetery where a simple marker honored Sarah Stroud's memory. The inscription, chosen by Caleb and Elizabeth together, read, "Sarah Stroud, 1853–1865. Her brief life inspired a lifetime of service to children. Through education, her story continues." Clara knelt beside the marker and spoke quietly to the girl whose death had set in motion the chain of events that saved Mary's life and transformed their entire family. "Thank you," she whispered simply, "for the brother and sister who loved you enough to turn their grief into hope for other children, for the example of what happens when good people refuse to let tragedy be the end of the story." As Clara made her way back toward the school, she encountered Caleb sitting on a fallen log beside the path, whittling a piece of pine with the same careful attention he brought to all his tasks. "Working on something special?" Clara asked, settling beside him. "A toy horse for one of the new students," Caleb replied, showing her the emerging shape of a galloping stallion. "His family had to leave everything behind when they came here. Thought he might like something to remind him that some journeys lead to better places." Clara watched Caleb's weathered hands shape the small figure, marveling at the gentleness this feared mountain man brought to such delicate work. "Do you ever regret the way your life turned out? The solitary years, the hard choices that brought you to the mountains?" Caleb was quiet for several minutes, considering the question while his knife carved careful details into the horse's mane. "I regret that Sarah didn't live to see what grew from our loss," he said finally. "But I don't regret the path that led me to you and Mary, to this work, to the chance to honor her memory through service to other children. What will you do now, with the schools expanding and Mary grown into a teacher herself?" "Keep finding families who need what we offer," Caleb said simply, Keep making sure that desperate parents know they have options beyond charity or surrender. There's always another family facing impossible choices, always another child whose potential is threatened by circumstances beyond their control. That evening, as Clara packed for her first trip as regional family education coordinator, she found herself holding the rag doll that had traveled with Mary from Copper Ridge to Caleb's cabin to the school. Mary had asked her to carry it to the first new school as a reminder that education was about preserving childhood while preparing children for adulthood. "It's perfect," Mary said, watching her mother pack the small toy alongside official documents and educational materials. "She's seen everything we've been through, and now she'll help other children understand that scary changes can lead to wonderful discoveries." The next morning brought a scene that perfectly captured how much their world had transformed. Clara stood beside the school's front entrance, wearing traveling clothes that spoke of professional purpose rather than desperate flight. Mary, now 16, and radiant with the confidence of someone who knew her own mind, embraced her mother with the easy affection of people who trusted their bond to survive any separation. Elizabeth provided last-minute instructions about families Clara would meet at her first destination, while Caleb checked the harness on the sturdy wagon that would carry Clara and her supplies to the territorial capital. "Write to us about everything," Mary said as Clara climbed onto the wagon seat. "I want to hear about every family you help, every child who discovers new possibilities." "I will," Clara promised. "And remember that no matter how far this work takes me, you'll always be the reason I understand how to help other families. Your courage in embracing education, in trusting strangers with your future, that's what taught me that impossible situations can become incredible opportunities." As the wagon rolled away from the school, Clara turned back for one last look at the place that had transformed her family's story. The building looked solid and permanent against the backdrop of eternal mountains, but she knew that its real significance lay not in the structure itself, but in the lives it had changed, the futures it had made possible. The morning sun caught the windows of the Sarah Stroud Memorial Library, sending light dancing across the courtyard where students were already gathering for their first classes of the day. In a few years, some of these children would graduate and carry their education to other frontier communities, becoming teachers, leaders, and advocates for the transformative power of learning. Mary stood waving from the school's front steps, her father's cross catching the sunlight, and her face bright with the anticipation of someone who knew that every ending was also a beginning. Beside her, Elizabeth and Caleb represented the quiet dedication that made extraordinary transformations possible through ordinary acts of service. As Clara's wagon disappeared into the forest, carrying her toward new challenges and new opportunities to serve families in crisis, the school bell rang across the mountain valley. It was the same bell that had called Mary to her first day of classes, the same sound that announced each day's commitment to the revolutionary idea that every child deserved the chance to discover their potential. But now the bell was ringing for Clara too, calling her to the next chapter of a story that had begun with impossible choices and grown into unlimited possibilities. The desperate widow who had once felt powerless to help her own child had become a regional coordinator with the authority and expertise to help hundreds of families navigate their own paths from crisis to opportunity. The rag doll in Clara's travel bag had witnessed it all: the tears of separation, the fear of uncertainty, the gradual dawning of hope, and finally the joy of transformation. Now she would carry that testimony to new families, new children, new stories of how the most frightening moments could become doorways to futures no one had dared to imagine. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal and protective, guardians of a valley where broken families discovered they could become whole in ways they had never expected. And ahead lay the promise of countless other communities where Clara's work would help ensure that no child would face the choice between family and future, between love and opportunity, The story that had begun with a debt notice and a desperate bargain had become something far larger, a testament to the truth that sometimes the most meaningful families are forged not by blood, but by shared commitment to serving something greater than themselves, in helping each other discover possibilities they couldn't see alone. Clara, Mary, Elizabeth, and Caleb had created not just an educational institution, but a legacy of hope that would ripple through generations of children yet to be born. As the wagon wheels turned toward tomorrow, carrying Clara toward her new role as an advocate for families in crisis, the sound of the school bell faded into the distance, but its message remained clear. In a world where circumstances could change everything overnight, education was the one gift that could never be lost, never be stolen, and never stop opening new doors to the future.